Okay, good morning, Attorney Venora, Attorney Vaughn. Are there any administrative matters before we resume this morning?
Yes, good morning. The company has two outstanding read-ins, numbers 7 and 8, and Ms. Palella has the information and can provide those
Very
at this
good.
time.
So the first one was in reference to, I think, defining the payment aggregator block fee. So what that is payment aggregators will go to banks and offer to aggregate their individual customer payments. So like if you have your own personal bank and you set up to pay your utility, the bank would ordinarily send a check for you. So what these payment aggregators do is they establish a business relationship with the banks, and then they send the payments on behalf of the bank, but they turn them into credit cards. So what ends up being is that the company would then pay, if the company were paying, if it were fee-free, the company would be paying that fee versus when they would be getting a check, which there would be no fee. So the block allows the system to identify what payments are coming in that fashion and block it. So then the aggregator needs to just send a check on behalf of the customer.
Okay. All right. And then there was a read-in 8, I think, also.
Yeah, I think that was in relation to a question about the ACH fees that were at the bottom of the spreadsheet that was submitted. That was used in the original filing when we couldn't distinguish at that time between residential and commercial for the ACH. So we did a blended rate. There's a chart above that that indicates the total fee amount, the number of payments, did a calculation and just had a blended rate that we used for the original calculation for when we added the ACH. When the request came in for just residential, we then took a second look. We were able to distinguish residential. And so when we calculated the ACH for that, we used the $395 fee instead of that blended fee.
Okay. Thank you. And we also have one correction to a late filed exhibit that we identified prior to today's hearing. I can have Mr. Daniels provide that.
Okay.
Mr. Daniels, I understand in preparation for today's hearing, you identified the need for a correction to late file exhibit 109. Is that right?
That is correct.
Can you please provide that for the record?
Yes, in the response to LFE 109, it says in the test year, the amount of penalties imposed to the call center vendor totaled $2,577. The correction to that is the amount. The amount should have been $1,288 for the test year.
Okay. All right, thank you. And that's all we have.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Then we will resume with cross for this panel, and I believe we're starting with Ms. Vigrass.
Thank you, Jenna Vigrass, Authority staff. So I will start first with late file exhibit 98, which discusses the penalties the company issued to the third party call center, iCorp. So first, can you say how the company found out about the contract violations for which penalties were issued?
So those penalties, the service level penalties, is tied directly to the call center metrics, which we get on a daily basis, monthly basis. So that's extremely transparent. So we can reconcile that with the data that we know back to if there should be a penalty. So the service level metrics are what we receive every day. The compliance penalties are actually phone calls that there's a regulatory complaint. We research that, and if it's tied back to an iCorp agent, then we can apply that penalty. So that's how that piece works.
Okay, thank you very much. So specifically what these contract violations were, can you provide a little more detail as to what the service level violations were?
Right. So if there is a day, for instance, where there's a forecasted number of calls that are supposed to come in, and the vendor is expected to be staffed, handle that volume, and hit our service level targets. like 70% of those calls need to be answered within 30 seconds. If the phone volume is less than forecast, they should absolutely hit that service level. But if they don't, then for the number of calls that day, we apply like a 5 cent, 10 cent, 15 cent penalty to every call that day.
Okay, thank you. So would you say that each of the service level penalties that are provided in LFE 98 were related to the average speed of answer metric and the call center not hitting that metric?
Those two metrics are tied together, but the service level penalty, that penalty is specifically tied to service level.
Okay,
Service level is a metric that's an indicator of the speed in which you answer customer calls. So they are closely tied together. They are not the same metric, but very closely tied together.
okay, thank you. So specifically, all of those penalties were related to how quickly the representative answered a call.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So the penalties were not related to specifics about collections information
No.
that a representative gave?
No.
Okay, thank you. So again, you said the response indicates that penalties of 10 cents or 15 cents per call were given as service level penalties. What is the highest service level penalty amount that the company can assess?
15 cents per call.
Okay, thank you. And can you provide a little more detail as to how the company decides between those amounts?
So there are thresholds. If they miss service level by X amount, they get it's black and white. It's not something that we just determine. But if they miss service level by X amount, they incur a 5 cent penalty. In between, the next level, 10%, and if they miss it by a certain threshold beyond that, then it's 15 cents, and it doesn't go higher than that.
Okay, thank you. And the response says that 15 cents per call were applied to a certain amount of calls. Are those all of the calls in which a representative was violating the service level requirement? Or were those all of the calls that were received by the third-party call center in that month?
It's aggregated by month, right? So it's the average monthly answer rate times the monthly call volume. So for every call that month, the penalty would be assessed on that amount.
Okay, thank you. So it's not looking at every single call that went above.
Yeah, it's not individualized by call.
Okay.
It's a metric. It's a monthly metric. If the monthly metric is not met, then the entire call volume for that month is subject to penalty.
Okay, thank you. And for the compliance penalties, is it $200 for one single violation in that a single customer reported a complaint to the authority?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And are the service level penalties and compliance penalties determined through the contracting process?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you describe at what point during the contracting process they're determined?
Well, so right now we're in the middle of trying to complete a renewal contract with ICOR that may include both penalties and incentives. And so that will be determined in the contract development phase before we even sign the contract. So that's what we're working on right now, is to determine what level of penalties, what level of incentives make sense for the next 3 years as we look to sign that contract. And that's what we're working on right now.
For the last two contracts, at least, the penalties associated with the contract are part of the RFP process to allow the vendors to bid appropriately and judge risk. So those are part of the RFP. They can be negotiated upwards or downwards as part of the negotiation process, but fees are stipulated in the RFP.
Okay, thank you. And those fees specifically, they're applied to all of Avangrid's subsidiaries that are contracting with the vendor?
It depends. Certain measures and certain metrics or KPIs differ from state to state. So it could differ from state to state as far as what the penalty amount is or what the actual metric that carries a penalty is.
Okay, thank you. And is that stipulated in the RFP?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Is it the company's position that the current amount of service level and compliance penalties are effective in reducing violations by the vendor?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. So does the company have a position on whether the current amount of service level and compliance penalties are effective in reducing violations by the vendor?
So I think we took a different approach with this current RFP. We've done some had some conversations with consultants who have given us some insight to best practices for outsourcing calls to a vendor. And the assessment of penalties in the next contract is proposed to be done differently with a much larger weight of penalty to non-compliance. And it's also, rather than a per call reduction, it's a reduction of overall invoice. And really the methodology is you set the targets that you would like or you need the vendor to adhere to, and there's severe penalty if there's non-compliance.
Thank you for that. So, are you able to comment on whether the penalty amounts are higher or lower than they were in the previous contract?
They are higher,
Higher? Okay.
yes.
Could you provide what the penalties are in the new contract?
Right now, so if you look at a cost per call basis, you're looking at, $6 per call, 15 cents. That's about 1%, maybe. We're looking at raising that to about 15 to 20.
15%.
Yes,
It just, and we have finalized the Alorica contract.
yes.
We have yet to finalize the I-Corps portion of the contract today.
Thank you. And are the penalties the same for the Alorica contract?
In the Alorica contract, the penalties are higher, and that's been signed, and we're going to be submitting that as a supplement. To be able to take a look at that, we're still in negotiations. Yes, we want them both to be the same, but we're still working on the I-Corps one.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now, moving to late file exhibit 108, continuing to discuss penalties. Can you explain why the company chose to not issue penalties to I-Corps during 2020?
Yes, I can add more detail around that. So, generally speaking, it was a challenging time. Call volume actually dropped for the most part for all utilities across the country. And so our third-party vendor was actually producing really good results during that time. They were actually a little probably overstaffed at that time. So we know that there was a burden because the call volume was dropping way down and they were still having to pay for staff. And overall, they were providing really good results for the year. I think year end, we had a below 70 second ASA. And so just, with an agreement that, yeah, this has been a very challenging year for everybody, we're not going to, we'll document those penalties, but we didn't apply them for that year.
Okay, thank you for that. And was there another way in which the company responded to those violations if they weren't issuing penalties?
Well, yeah, I mean, we are in contact with our vendor hourly, daily, watching in real time the results. And so during that time, if we're seeing the vendor results not meeting expectations, we are in constant contact of what are the problems? How can we help? How do we? And sometimes if it's things you can react to quickly, very quickly. Some things may take some time, and staffing attrition is something that can happen very quickly, and it may take a few months to catch up on that. And so, but we try to be prepared for that. So we didn't take any monetary approach to that, but we do stay in contact with our vendor to try to make sure that they are taking the right steps to meet our expectations.
And the other consideration for, some of the penalties as they occurred, I believe later during 2020, those were some of the reasons why they didn't have staffing available to answer phone calls was related directly to the pandemic and illness and those sorts of things. So we were trying to maintain a good partnership with our vendor under trying circumstances.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. So following up on that, the master services agreement with iCor extends beyond services provided to UI customers. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And does UI recover its portion of expenses associated with the master services agreement with iCor through base distribution rates?
One moment.
Sure.
Yeah, we would presumably yes, but we can confirm through a supplement.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
A supplement is fine, but I missed the LFE reference.
I think it's 108.
108, yes.
Okay, I think we already have 2 supplements to 108 pending, so if we can just capture it in one of those, please.
Okay, thank you. So as you alluded to earlier, the company finalized its contract with Alorica as of last Friday. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And so now that Alorica will be handling the move-in, move-out calls, does the company expect a reduction in costs, in contract costs with iCor?
Yes. So if I'm understanding the question, so the contract price for all of the outsourced calls is higher today than it was 3 years ago, and that's mostly due to labor costs and things like that. The decision to go to Alorica for the move-in, move-outs, if we chose to stay with iCor, it's pretty nominal difference. So I would say the entire contract that we have now is higher than it was 3 years ago, and if we chose to go with iCor instead of Alorica, it would still be about the same. That makes sense.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so now moving on to a different topic. So late file exhibit 100, attachment 1 specifically includes the talking points that were distributed to customer service representatives. And so I'm specifically wondering, are these talking points specific to residential customers, or do they include information for commercial customers as well?
We would provide talking points if there were topics that needed to be addressed from a commercial perspective, but generally that isn't necessary. What's listed here are all the talking points that we had captured and sent out through the contact center that were developed by our communications team.
Okay, thank you. So you're not sure if it includes information for commercial customers?
I don't know if there's any commercial talking points in that attachment. And I don't know that we have sent any talking points regarding commercial customers through that channel.
Okay, thank you. And can you describe how these talking points are distributed to internal customer service representatives and third-party customer service representatives? For example, is it through email or letter? Does someone make an announcement, etc.?
So generally, it's sent through an email to the entire center, including our counterparts in our third-party centers. And then based upon the nature of what is in the talking points, we'll either have follow-up huddles with supervisors to review and make sure that representatives understand what's contained. They also have the ability to ask questions if they need clarification. And we also, during department meetings, will review and emphasize topics that are contained in talking points.
Great, thank you. And how do CSRs reference the talking points during calls?
A variety of different ways. So they could refer to the email itself. We attempt to upload talking points to our knowledge base tool. That would be ideally the approach that we would take is a knowledge base tool where there's searchable functionality where a customer service representative while on a call, if they're looking at a particular topic, can go to a tool, search about the topic that they're wishing to speak to the customer about or that they need to get information about, pull up the information and be able to convey that to the customer or help the customer. I think what we've noted in the rate case is that we're lacking some of the support internally from a headcount perspective to be able to do that as consistently as we would like. And that's why we asked for additional headcount for a knowledge-based analyst.
Perfect, thank you. So as of right now, the CSR would reference, I guess, the email that the
Email or it would be uploaded into a Teams folder as another potential channel. They also, some representatives would save, meaningful talking points to their desktop. They have multiple screens. They could have talking points pulled up for them if it's a call type that they get quite often. So there's multiple different ways. I think the ideal way, as far as what we think is best practice, would be to have a robust knowledge-based tool for customer service representatives to utilize during these situations.
Right, thank you. So late file exhibit 101, attachment 1, and specifically looking at, I believe it's the last page 26.
Yes.
Great. So this document refers customer service representatives to additional training documents regarding collection procedures. So can you explain whether these are training documents for CSRs or are they corporate procedure documents?
So they're not corporate procedure documents. They are documents and I think I spoke to, what our procedural documents are, and generally they're how to perform the transaction within our customer information system. So it'd be a reference to, how to do this. So the example COL-L-005 bill forgiveness program would be the instruction on how to sign up a customer for the bill forgiveness program.
Okay, thank you. And can you confirm when those materials were last updated?
Yeah, those particular documents are in process. I believe they're almost completed as far as updating. We're just doing some final reviews, but we've been, as we mentioned in previous testimony, we've been actively updating procedures, and our goal is by early second quarter to have them all updated. So I know that in particular those have been worked. I just don't know if they're in their final stages.
Okay, thank you. So prior to the most recent updates, do you know when the last date was that they were updated?
Don't have that readily available.
Okay.
I can speak in relative terms for me. So the bill forgiveness program, that particular procedure is a newer procedure, so that would have been developed, a short time ago.
Right. Okay, thank you. So moving on now to late file exhibit 113, which discusses the customer service vendors that the company currently has. Specifically, can you explain what service Intrado Interactive Services is currently providing for UI?
Yeah, Intrado is our high volume call answering solution. So, when we have significant storm events where we're receiving, thousands of calls per hour, we don't have the capacity in terms of, phone trunks to handle that volume. So we've contracted out to Intrado. They have the capacity to handle that type of call. So we go into our AT&T portal. AT&T is, one of our vendors that one of our call carriers. So we can redistribute call volume at the AT&T level and send to our high volume call answering solution so that customers won't receive a busy signal when they call us. Because once we reach max capacity with our internal call answering solution, customers would receive a busy signal.
That vendor name has changed, so some folks might be familiar with 21st Century
West.
or West. So we might have talked about this in previous conversations with Pura. I just wanted to mention that Intrado is the more recent name.
Okay, thank you for that. And so specifically, they are not answering calls for UI, they're just picking up the line, but the person would still be on hold.
Really, it's a replication of our internal IVR and it does not have an option to speak with a customer service representative.
Okay.
The customer they can enter in an outage ticket. They can enter in a trouble notification. If we have estimated restoration times available, they'd receive that information. So it's really an automated solution.
Okay, great, thank you. And can you also describe the user experience services provided by Blink UX?
Yep. So Blink UX has been a vendor that we've used for the past 18 months that have came in and helped us redesign our end-to-end journeys for the move in and move out experience. We've also utilised them in some of the other Avangrid companies to redesign our new connections journey. Up in New York, they really offer services such as coming in, interviewing our customers, interviewing our stakeholders, creating concepts, doing the concept testing with users in the user recruitment, and then also building out the prototypes, and then the final designs that we then pass to our internal IT teams that then build that out.
Perfect, thank you. So the company's response to LFE 113 shows that the company is currently contracted with 5 third-party collections agencies. My understanding was that the company only contracted with 4 third-party collections agencies at a time, 2 primary and 2 secondary. So can you explain why the company currently has 5 collections agencies?
Yeah, there are currently 2 primary and 2 secondary. I just want to confirm. I believe Debt Next is the company that is the 5th, and they are actually the middleware between the company and the vendors. So they'll get the files and then they distribute them out to the primary and the secondary vendors. So they're not technically, that we should have probably edited that description. They're not a third-party collections agency, but they're part of the process to distribute those accounts to that third-party agencies, which are the 4 that we talked about, the primary and the secondary.
Great. Okay, thank you. And can you clarify which vendors are your primary agencies versus your secondary agencies?
Yes. Yeah, so the primary are Penn Credit and Revco, and the secondary are Eastern and IC Systems.
Okay, thank you. And can you describe the length of the company's contracts with these third-party collections agencies? Are they established in parallel timeframes, or does the company continuously reassess agencies and establish new contracts with vendors?
They were part of the same RFP. Let me just double check the dates on the contract.
Sure.
Yeah, we believe the contract was signed in 2021, but that's subject to check. I can do a quick check on that.
Sure.
And I believe they were a 3-year contract.
Okay.
I'm gonna double check that.
Okay, sure, thank you. So I don't know if we should establish a read-in.
We'll probably have it momentarily.
Okay. And then, so you spoke a little bit about this, but how does the company establish new vendor contracts for legal collections firms and third-party collections agencies?
Basically, we would go out to RFP. So for the third-party collection agency, we did that collectively with all the Avangrid Networks companies, and then, you know, determine based on the bids which ones we selected.
And does the company issue RFPs every 3 years? Is that the current practice?
It's not a standard, depending on the relationship with the vendor. So the legal collections firm, Nair & Levin, we've had them for, I believe, since 20. Yeah, subject to check. I think it was 2012. We started the relationship with the Nair & Levin,
Okay.
which is the legal collections firm.
And does the company ever pursue sole source contracting with the collections agencies or firms?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. So those are all of my questions.
Okay, just pause for a second and see if they have the answer to that question, and if not, we can establish a read-in.
Yeah, so for the third-party collection vendors, it was March 2021 that we entered into that contract, and it is a 3-year contract.
Right, thank you. All right, Ms. Cohen.
Thank you. Good morning to the panel. Stephanie Cohen, Authority staff. So just a quick follow-up, just to make sure I understand. The third-party collections agencies all resulted from the same RFP, so you essentially contract with 4 different vendors at the same time that have the same duration of contract?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. While we're on late file 113, just wanted to make sure. I was thinking about, you mentioned, one of the witnesses mentioned the IVR service. Is that also a third-party service, or is that something that's internal to the company? And if it is, where would it fall within the list of vendors?
Yeah, under call center technology, Genesis is our vendor for our internal IVR and ACD. It's a premise-based solution that we're currently deploying. So we have the hardware on site in our data center in Orange.
Okay, thanks. And so is there anything else besides the IVR that the Genesis vendor provides?
So it's a suite of products. So we have IVR, ACD, reporting, as well as quality assurance, call recordings, those sorts of things, as well as their product SpeechMiner, which we've been gearing up to use, which is a speech analytics tool.
Okay, thank you. That was going to be my next question, if speech analytics falls within that category. And so is this can you speak to the current contract duration with Genesis?
So I can't speak to the current contract duration. I know that we will be issuing an RFP for these types of services. The Genesis solution that we have is scheduled to be end of life at some point soon. And most contact center vendors are migrating to a cloud-based solution. So we're exploring opportunities to move our contact center telephony platform to a cloud-based solution.
Okay, thank you. Is the current contract with Genesis, are you able to say whether it extends beyond the UI companies?
It does.
Okay, and so is this like an Avangrid level, I don't know, reevaluation of the Genesis
It
services?
is, and really it's an industry sort of reevaluation. Years ago, premise-based contact center solutions were plentiful. There are very few that still are in existence. Most have migrated to the cloud. Genesis actually offers a cloud migration service. So we're exploring what options would be best for not only UI, but also Avangrid in terms of, our future with our contact center telephony platform.
Okay, thank you. And that will be through an RFP process or a sole source?
That'll be through an
process?
RFP process, correct?
And is that underway currently, or?
Yes.
Do you have a timeline for, has RFP been issued, I guess, then, or?
It has not, but we're very, very close. So we've actually finalized the RFP internally on what we want, and then we're just gonna kind of review it. So I imagine very, very soon we're gonna send it out.
One of the last steps is just finalizing our vendor list of who we want to send this out to. So reaching out to peer utilities to see what services they're using, understanding, their experience with some of these vendors to try to hone in on the best possible solution.
Okay, that's helpful, thanks. And do you have a sense of the timing of, I guess, procurement process and selecting a vendor through that RFP process?
One moment.
So I don't think that's known at this time. However, once the RFP is issued, personal experience with upgrading contact center technology, it's about an 18 to 24 months turnaround. So we're looking at, sometime in 2024 likely
To have new or expanded
to have
capabilities, basically.
a new implementation.
A new implementation. And in the interim, the current Genesis contract will provide speech analytics, IVR
Correct.
associated
Yes.
services.
And also just noteworthy is that this is for our internal centers, our internal Avangrid centers. Our third-party centers have their own vendor, which they utilize for call handling, speech analytics. I think there's been reference to Baldy as the speech analytics tool that ICOR currently deploys. Alorica would have a separate speech analytics tool. Within scope of the RFP process is the potential that this could be across third-party vendors as well as an internal solution, but that also has not been decided yet.
Okay, thank you. And so with sticking with the speech analytics, that the ICOR and Alorica capabilities, is that something how is that shared or communicated with UI? Is that like on a request only basis? Are there certain stipulations perhaps in the contract?
I'm not aware that we've shared any speech analytics with Pura or EOE, but that is an option. I think there's a outstanding request out there to start doing something like that. So, I think it's just a collaboration that if we wanted to use speech analytics at the vendor level, we just need to have a discussion on what
Okay.
that would look like.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think my question is also about what the current level of information sharing between the company and the vendor with regards to their speech analytics kind of takeaways, if you will, or like summary reports.
So I think very little has been done with speech analytics to this point. I think we're in the beginning stages of being able to write queries that give us that directional data and trending that we're looking to understand. You need to continually modify your queries to make sure that you bring in the correct information, and so they have a high degree of confidence in the results that come back. So we haven't done anything breaking in terms of speech analytics yet, but we are, working with iCore to start to build up those queries so that we can, move forward with providing, more insight into trends and reasons why customers calls and opportunities to enhance the customer experience.
Okay, thank you. I think this might tie in, my next question might tie into late file, what we're talking about, but also late file 98, returning to that. So to make sure I understand the exchange from earlier, the two types of violations currently for iCore, the service level penalty that's tied to direct metrics. In other words, not necessarily what was or wasn't said on a given call, but just more of the volume. And then the compliance penalties, which do they solely, in order to raise the level of compliance penalty, does it solely have to be a customer complaint that's then reported to Pura, or there are some other circumstances there?
Yes, that's the qualification.
Okay. And is that set, the compliance penalty, is that kind of the standard, or is that something that's always negotiated between the company and the vendor?
Anything can be negotiated
Right.
at any given time, but that's pretty much the standard across all of
Okay.
our opcos.
So I guess what I'm trying to understand is so barring the compliance penalty where the customer then takes kind of separate follow-up action, or a service level penalty that's not necessarily directly related to a content of a conversation, is there a way for the company to audit, monitor, issue penalties to the vendor for the content of the information that was maybe incorrectly provided by a vendor?
Yeah, the means is there to audit, a fraction of the calls. And so the reason we quantify it with regulatory is because there can be some gray areas. There can be a lot of areas, you could pile up errors pretty quickly if you have a question, 25 questions on a form. So the means to do that on a broad scale, we don't really have the opportunity to review every single call. We do a small percentage of those. Of those, we would have the means to maybe put something together, but we haven't as of yet.
Do you think that that's where speech analytics could provide additional tools for UI or Avangrid to kind of be continuously monitoring the content of the vendor conversations, not just the volume at which they're kind of processed?
I think there's an opportunity to do some of that. Just want to level set expectations as to the amount of effort that's required, and resources that are required to get to maybe a level of detail where you can monitor every agent's call to make sure they're in compliance. I don't know that speech analytic tools are necessarily robust enough to have that impact. What I can say is that there are certain things that you'd be able to key in on and provide directional data in terms of if there was scripting that was required, that sort of thing. If we can make sure that certain parts of the script are being read, and if that's not, then you can get a report of those calls where that did not happen, or where that did happen. Then you have an opportunity to dig down and further listen to those calls. That's this type of insight that speech analytics can provide, but
Mhm.
it can't necessarily provide high degree of confidence on whether or not agents are hitting on everything that they're supposed to.
The intentions, especially as we move into these new contracts, is to absolutely hold the vendor accountable for any issues that are caused, whether it be a customer calling us to tell us about it, whether it be as a result of a call that's been listened to by any member of anyone's staff. Any feedback that we get, our intention is to act on that and hold the vendor accountable. I would need to check in on the exact language in the new contracts, but I know that our interest was to make that much more robust so that we can make sure that we're holding them accountable and expecting the same level of excellence that we expect from our internal contact centers as well.
Okay, thank you. Would any of that information in terms of the level of expectations or the level of service be reflected in the RFP language that was issued?
One more time,
Sure.
please.
So just following up on Isabella's explanation about trying to like set a higher standard and how that was communicated, I'm wondering if that was reflected in the RFP that the company issued.
It is, and there's an expectation. So the primary way to measure quality is to audit calls and to measure that quantifiably with a score. And so we're going to require the vendor to audit a certain amount of calls. We'll also be listening to calls, and we're going to audit the auditors as well. And so there will be, an aggregate of all of your calls need to be, say, 85% or above in terms of quality. That's how we measure quality. So there is no penalty, if they go below it, but that's how we're measuring quality right now.
And you said there's no penalty if they go below that level of quality. Is that not something that the company sees as a tool to ensure high quality calls? I mean, because there's the monitoring aspect, right? But then there's also, we see these compliance and service level penalties as a direct price signal, if you will. So just wondering if that has been incorporated in this latest round of contract negotiations.
Yeah, it's currently not in there, and I understand your point, and something to consider, but it's not something we included in this current RFP.
Do you know if if the current RFP, at least, I understand that the contract negotiations are in process, but do you know if the RFP itself has been filed in the record here?
I do not believe it has.
Chairman, I'd like to see if we might be able to add that. I'm trying to see if it might be most appropriate for late file 98. I know we have a supplement already for 108. You're kind of all both centered around the types of penalties. And the reason why I'm asking just for the RFP language is just try to understand kind of the status quo contracts that we have and then the level of expanded level of accountability, let's call it, that the company is interested in providing with its vendors.
And we'd also like to just, if we could take a look back at what's already been in the contract that's signed, as well as in the RFP regarding any sort of penalties or step penalties for not just non-compliance, but also quality assurance results. We understand that, any vendor or even our internal call center, there are going to be some customer service representatives that don't meet quality standards on some calls. And when a customer service representative takes 1,000 calls in a month, and you listen to 4 to 8 calls, there's a chance that they may not have done as well as you may have liked them to do, right? And we would coach them and provide them feedback. And so that's, one of the reasons why there may be not significant penalties associated with the quality assurance, but I think we do want to take a look back at what's in the contract and the RFP, because I feel like there might be something that points to that.
Okay, understood.
Just to be clear, which RFP are we discussing? I know we've been
So
talking about a couple over the
fair
past
point,
few.
fair point. So as I understand it, there's a current contract negotiations with ICOR, but I'm looking for a step prior to that, the RFP that ICOR then presumably responded to, and I recognize that that's in progress still, but the terms that and the objectives that the company laid out, I think would be helpful
Sure.
as we look at these questions around compliance and service level penalties and quality assurance. So is that helpful? Okay, sure.
Okay, so it's a supplement to LFE 98.
Excuse me. Yes, and with that, I think those are all the questions I have for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that completes cross for the authority staff. Okay, very good. Thank you. Attorney Wright?
We have no questions. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, so questions from the bench, Commissioner Karen? Oh, Mr. Vice Chairman. Okay, I just have a couple of questions here. Earlier in cross with authority staff, there was Mr. Daniels, I think you responded that the penalty amounts and metrics may differ from state to state, and I just didn't hear an explanation as to why.
So I can give some context to that by example. In New York, the service level metric, or actually in Maine, the service level metric for that they've set with the Maine PUC is 80% of calls within 30 seconds. So it's a higher standard as opposed to the 70% of calls in 30 seconds that UI currently maintains.
Okay, so the lower standard that UI maintains, that's a standard that you apply to your operating companies in the absence of a higher standard from other jurisdictions. Is that the right way to think about it?
So I think we landed on the 70% and 30-second target because it more closely mirrored our historical performance with an average speed of answer target of 90 seconds with technology.
Okay. So was there any consideration given to if there was, I know we're just focused on this example, but others that may be applicable in terms of differing from state to state, was there any decision to just raise the penalty amounts and metrics to, I guess what's the opposite of a lowest common denominator, the highest common denominator, if you will, so that that all of your customers were receiving similar or identical service?
You know, I think there's always consideration to levelize across the companies to share best practices, but at the same time, you know, some of these metrics do drive cost to customer. So it's a balance of, you know, trying to keep costs down for customers versus, you know, hitting a standardized metric across the Avangrid utilities. For example, the difference between, you know, an 80% service level in 30 seconds and 70% in 30 seconds, there's a significant cost in terms of the amount of headcount required in order to hit that target. So I think it's more or less trying to balance the needs of the customers and the expectations and our historical performance with what would ultimately drive cost to customer.
Thank you. Is there any consideration given to whether there are economies of scale in the contracting stage, though, in terms of if you were requesting a uniform level of service from the vendors?
Always trying to leverage economies of scale. I think where that becomes to some degree, you know, problematic, or we're not quite there yet, is that we have different jurisdictions, different tariffs, different compliance metrics, different customer information systems. So the expectation that we'd be able to scale a thing like customer calls across states and across a vendor, you know, it isn't realistic at this time. Just the ability to do that and do that well would be problematic.
Yeah, I think our interest is, we talk about that often, about how do we get more efficient with handling calls, as we have, you know, small groups of handling SCG, CNG, UI. The vendor does try to blend them to some extent, but we want to get the right tools in place so that it makes it easier for the representative to be able to understand all the requirements for each company, the different procedures, that there might be slightly. So we need to enhance our tools so that we have a better interactive experience with the representatives, so that they're not constantly having to refer to different training documents, that perhaps the system would pop up something to say, oh, this is CNG, so don't forget to say this, that, and the other. So we're working on that, and we're discussing opportunities to get better at that. And I think that's our ultimate goal.
Thank you. Also in discussions with staff a few moments ago, I think one of the responses was there was a decision to forego assessing penalties to vendors in 2020. And my quick recollection is that there were at least one, if not two, NOVs assessed by the authority in 2021 relating to violations that occurred in 2020. So I guess my question is whether the decision to forego assessing penalties to the vendors in 2020 was made before or after, or not in consideration at all, of the NOVs that were assessed by the authority for shortcomings in 2020.
Yeah, so specifically to penalties assessed in 2020, again, that was really just trying to be a partner with our vendor, understanding that they were going through some very trying times with impacts with COVID and illness amongst their supervisor teams, amongst their representatives. They were dealing with the chaos that everyone else was, and trying to be empathetic to their situation and maintain a good partnership for what was relatively small value penalties.
And in addition, so those penalties would have been waived in 2020, and I think the NOV came in 2021. Those penalties would have been tied to service level metrics. The NOV was more towards quality of the call. So I don't think the two were tied together at the time. If that answers the question.
Okay. Thank you. So I think I had some questions during the evidentiary hearings, but on this topic, but I was not sure that I understood the answer based on previous cross today about what happens when those penalties are assessed. So, let me start with asking a question. I don't know if this is to Mr. Daniels or Mr. Jahota or maybe Ms. Palella. Foundational question about whether you're aware of NOVs issued by the authority that may contain language prohibiting recovery of penalties from vendors that are assessed to the company.
Yes, so I'm aware of that.
Okay, so when penalties are assessed to your vendors, whether they're the service quality ones we've been discussing or what have you, what happens to that money?
The invoice we're not billed for that amount of cost. So for the $200, that the invoice would be reduced by that amount. So when we paid the invoice, it would be that less.
Okay.
And to clarify, the NOVs that were issued in 2021, the vendor did not receive penalty as a result of that. The company, provided the funding for those NOVs.
So you did not seek recovery from the vendor for the behavior?
No, we did not.
And to the questions, I think from my staff earlier, how do you, if you're not, so the company felt that it was appropriate not to penalize the vendor for behavior or shortcomings that were identified in the NOVs?
So there, as you can imagine, there were a lot of discussions at that time. We did recognize that there were a lot of changes happening, from 2020 to 2021. We introduced additional scripting. We introduced different variables that needed to be included in all the calls. And we also recognized that they were going through a lot of turnover because of the COVID pandemic. So we made a judgment at the time to not assess penalties to the vendor because of all those dynamics that were happening. We instead took all of our efforts toward how do we change this behavior and make it better going forward. And so we were meeting constantly, daily, weekly, monthly. We came up with action plans. We met with the vendor. We listened to calls together. We created a separate energy affordability sort of quality assurance mini form that we concentrated on. So we spent our efforts on trying to improve the performance, improve the level of training, improve the coaching as we moved forward.
Thank you. What does the company think the purpose of assessing the penalties to your vendor is? So certainly you see some value in assessing penalties to the vendors, as your late file exhibit shows that you did so in the years with the exception of 2020. So Mr. Daniels, Ms. Palella, what do you think the purpose of assessing those penalties was?
Yeah, the purpose would be to hopefully change behavior going forward as well.
Okay, thank you. My last question is about late file exhibit 113. There is a vendor towards the bottom half of the page, Intertight Corp. It says they provide services related to gas meter locks and barrels. And just explain to me the inclusion of that vendor on this list, please.
That looks like an oversight that's included. I think we got a list from our collections group, and that was included because the collections represent the group that provided this. It was gas and electric, so they included that. That should not have been included in hindsight.
Okay, so when you get a list of vendors, okay, so the request was for a list of vendors that the company uses for customer service related activities or for collections activities. And when you requested this list, are the vendors sometimes providing services to all of your UIL affiliates, or do they sometimes just provide services to one of the affiliates?
For this particular list, at times it's for multiple companies.
Okay, so when these charges are billed to your distribution companies, how are they being scrubbed or checked to make sure that you're billing the company, the distribution company?
Many of the, I can't speak to every single one of on the list, but many of them come in forms of separate invoices. So they're invoiced directly to the illuminating company as opposed to an Avangrid or UIL cost.
Okay, so the testimony is that Intertight is just an oversight here, and they have not actually been billed to UI distribution company
Correct.
customers. Okay, thank you. I believe those are my questions. So, Attorney Venora, do you need a moment to consider redirect?
Yes, if we could take just 5 minutes.
Okay, we'll recess for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that. Here is on the next one. This morning, although she was, anyway, she referenced the Guillermo being anyway, yeah, she mentioned that. But yeah, waiting for that. So it looks like there's 40 minutes there.
Is she gonna, not this is my business, but is she expected to be?
I don't think so. I'll confirm, but I don't. I know you showed me that.
Standing on your head. That's good.
Oh, really? Put it down. I do that all the time.
You can see it. It's good to you.
All right.
So did you say both your kids play softball?
Well, my son plays baseball.
Baseball.
Yeah. Yeah. And then my daughter plays soccer. And my son's performance running.
And you coach the softball team?
I did that. And it was super fun. It was the only time I ever did it.
Yes.
But she's in seventh right now, so it's not high. So that's it. That was my last chance. So that's what I had.
Yeah. I watched a lot of softball.
Did your kids play?
And my kids didn't really play, but my father-in-law was doing it, taking care of him. He's 96, he's a diehard Arizona fan.
Okay.
And he used to referee softball. He used to play softball. He was an athlete. He played softball and he refereed softball. And he loves Arizona softball. So
It's
that
fun.
was,
I get my daughter. My dad always played softball too, so I played golf. I was excited. My daughter didn't watch it first, but like as she got older, I grew up. That's fun.
yeah. Yeah, Brown tried out for the Boston Red Sox. This father-in-law, mine, the guy that's 96. Yeah, so this was like 1946. He tried out for the Boston Red Sox because he grew up in New England.
Yeah.
And he said he stayed the whole week. It was like a 5-day camp, and he didn't clean cut to the very last day. He said it was me or this other guy. And he said,
So it's different like back then. You just go. So like back then you would just go to tryouts.
I think so. I mean, I'm sure they did draft too,
Oh.
but then I think they had probably
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. He said, my strategy was I wasn't trying to hit the long ball. I was thinking I'll take the guy that gets hit. So, yeah, he said, so I went 3 for 5 that week. They took the guy that hit the green on. Yeah. And he said, it's probably good. He said, because I wasn't really good to be at that level.
I mean, you must have been pretty decent.
It's true.
Yeah.
He said one of the drills. I wasn't an athlete, but my dad was. He was like, I care to hear their stories. But he said one drill was to line up on the first base line and run to the left field wall. Squads of 20 because they wanted to, see who was fast. But he said his squad of 20, he was first one there. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How big is it?
Better than me.
Yeah. Huh.
Where did you grow up?
So, I mean, Binghamton area. I never home. You grew up in Arkansas?
Yeah, I was born in Texas, grew up in Arkansas,
Okay.
moved to Colorado.
Oh, so
Lived different places in Arkansas, moved to Colorado.
Oh, you were just in Colorado, right?
Yeah, all 3 of my kids, I have 3 daughters, and then
Okay.
they all live in
And
Colorado.
then all about there. How'd you get the name?
I wanted to live near the ocean. I was so close.
7 breaks. And my second wife, my now wife, is a wildlife biologist. She got that job a couple weeks ago after the VP. Contractor, part-time. They were capturing wildlife birds and tested. They were working for the federal government and their lawsuit against BP of what are the environmental damages. So the BP will spill. So they were catching loons and canids and different kind of birds. And they would draw blood, take a feather for DNA. And they were based in Coral Maine, just right outside. And so she liked it there. Anyway, they had a CFO job in a small company, but they were pros. They needed accounting capacity, so they opened this job for CFO.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your patience. We have just one question on redirect once our panel gets settled.
Okay.
Ms. Malella, you recall questions from the chair regarding late file 113 and the vendor Intertite Corporation. Did you get some further information on our quick break there that you can supplement your answer?
I did, so I stand corrected. Really, the description just sort of should have said meter locks and barrels because we do use them for both gas and electric, that vendor. So it is appropriate to be included there. And that would just be UI related activity for that particular vendor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all we have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. With that, we can excuse this panel. Thank you very much. I think we are going to try to do the clean energy transformation panel before lunch, as I think our cross estimates might end up being shorter than listed. So if I can call up that panel, please.
Do we need ROE? Yeah.
Thank you.
No. We'll do ROE after lunch. Thank you.
I mean, you're not there yet,
Oops. While we're transitioning the panel, we actually have an update to one of the read-ins that was provided yesterday that Mr. Canavan can provide. It relates to read-in number 3.
Okay.
This was on, I think, late file 85 it related to.
This is with regard to the English Station project managers and whether there's any loyalty payments to those employees.
Right.
Reviewing the question and the answer last night, we thought we provided a little additional clarification this morning. As you may remember, Mr. Hurwitz stated that none of the loyalty gifts reflected in the company's response to late file 85 were to employees that support English Station, and that is true, and it remains true. But after reviewing late file 85, we appreciate that there was an unintended caveat with regard to that answer, that late file 85 only limited that response to the test year. We can say definitively this morning that we just wanted to clarify that none of the company's English Station project members ever received a loyalty gift in their role related to English Station. And that's the further clarification for the record.
Thank you.
So while our panel gets situated, there's 2 persons identified on the witness list for this panel that are not in attendance today. However, the balance of the panel will be prepared and they're co-witnesses with the other members of the panel. Those are Mr. Rincon and Mr. Fernandez, but the other members of the panel are able to speak to their late filed exhibits.
So,
Okay, thank you. Attorney Vaughn?
thank you, Chairman Gillette. Give a second to Ms. Van Luling to come up, be part of the panel as well. But she's already been sworn and adopted her late file exhibits. So,
Very good.
Ms. King, Mr. Bochernak, Mr. Mader, Mr. Manning, Mr. Roby, and Mr. Rosa. As part of your preparation for this late filed exhibits hearing, did each of you sponsor or co-sponsor responses to late filed exhibit requests issued during the course of evidentiary hearings in this case?
Yes.
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 And do you have any corrections to any of your late filed exhibit responses?
No.
No.
Do you adopt your late filed exhibit responses as part of your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. This panel is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Capozzi?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, panel. Steve Capozzi with Authority Staff. I want to turn to late file exhibit 124, attachment 1, which is the DER load forecasting report.
Okay.
So reading the report, I have one page up, but just a couple general questions. First, reading the report, the company had load forecasts with the vendor for this pilot out to year 2025. Is that right?
Correct. Okay.
And those load forecasts included, did those load forecasts include sort of a baseline load forecast in addition to the different DER and EV scenarios?
Yeah, so there was a base level forecast, and then we had three basically adders or subtractors from that forecast.
Was that base level forecast different than a company's internal forecasting?
So the company's internal forecasting is more at the system level. We calculate sales and then convert that to a peak, system peak, and then those are allocated to our substations to assess for substation capacity. So this one, so the system level forecast did inform this forecast for the Ash Creek substation, but it was a separate.
Okay, and so especially in that, so the circuit level forecasts, the company doesn't have those.
Correct. That was the intent of this.
And determining the actual circuit level load, how did the company do that for this project?
So we do have telemetry and SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition at all of our circuits and feeders. So we have actual interval metering data to determine peak.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to turn to page 21 of the attachment, which make sure we're all on the same page. It's 21 of 31 for the attachment, page 20 of 30 here in the report. So these are the circuit level forecasts and actual load for 2019. Were the which forecasts were these? Were these were these the 90-10 weather normalized or the 50-50 weather normalized? Do you know?
I'm not sure if they're the 90-10 or the 50-50.
Okay. So it looks like there's let me ask. So this is for year 2019, and the prior page has 2018. Did the company continue? I mean, I think I understood earlier that you would have had load forecasts out for the different scenarios out to 2025.
Correct.
Did the company continue the analysis since this report looking at any years subsequent to 2019? So, for example, 2020, 2021, 2022?
We have not.
Okay. Okay, those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Firegrass?
Thank you. Jenna Vigrass, Authority staff. So now moving to the topic of electric vehicles, specifically looking at late file exhibit 126, which shows program administration incentives as well as or program administration expenses as well as incentives. So specifically, first, can you describe what types of costs are currently included in the program administration expenses?
Yes, currently expenses included in program administration include outreach and education, rebate processing, vendor fees, and for the residential programs, technology integration costs to enable and manage charging programs.
Okay, thank you. Can you provide a bit more detail about the technology integration for managed charging?
Sure. What type of detail would you like me to provide?
I guess what is included in that? Is it staff time or is it a new vendor or?
Sure. So the technology integration costs, the company's provided as a separate line item. We've included them as program administration for the purposes of these filings, but in the original and subsequent program year review filings, in our budgets, we've submitted them in the residential sector as a separate line item detailing technology integration. So the managed charging programs require the companies to connect with right now hundreds, potentially in the future thousands of individual residential EV driver devices, whether that be an EV charger or a telematics in an EV itself. And we do that through a cloud platform. So the technology integration services really could be considered a software as a service provider, a vendor to the company. In previous annual review periods, the companies have provided an explanation of how our platform works. We have a mobile app that every customer can, so that all of that is included in those costs.
Thank you. And so is that technology integration portion, is that the reason why the administration expenses for the residential program area are much higher than for the commercial program areas?
Yes, and that I would say is the nature of managed charging programs. We see this also in other jurisdictions where we operate managed charging programs. Residential, again, we have hundreds of enrolled customers as opposed to dozens of EV charger installations in the make-ready infrastructure. Plus, we're not really integrating or controlling load on public DC fast chargers, let's say, for example. So yes, those costs are, that's one of the reasons. We also had in the first year initial setup costs that would not be incurred, one-time setup fees that would not be included in future years.
Okay, thank you. And does the company foresee that there might be technology integration costs associated with the light duty fleet managed charging program?
So potentially, as the company's explained, I think in our most recent filings in 220806, the light duty program. So we provided a fairly detailed description around the ability of technology integration providers to integrate with commercial chargers versus residential equipment, being electric vehicle, telematics, or an at-home charger. Commercial managed charging, I think we see being very nascent, even more nascent than residential managed charging. We certainly appreciate the authorities' desire to move the needle there, and so we are, as a company, also working along with the authority to help integrate um, commercial applications into a managed charging, um, into the managed charging realm, let's say. We are experiencing this same thing in other jurisdictions that we operate within, particularly in New York, where the jurisdictions are desiring to move into the commercial, not only just the commercial space, but also medium heavy duty vehicle managed charging. And I think this is a situation where policy and regulatory desires are really pushing the envelope further than technology has gotten at this point. So, if you recall from the light duty filings, we might be able to integrate with some commercial chargers. It's likely that we will not be able to integrate with all commercial chargers. It's just not something the market has invested in because there hasn't been a need to.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And specifically for the program administration expenses for the commercial program areas, so not for the residential program areas, can you explain why they are the same for each commercial program area in this response?
Sure. So really so we don't really track our program administration costs by program area. So the authority has created several program areas to create a distinction and perhaps equitably distribute infrastructure across certain customer classes, let's say, or locations, as the case may be, or charging use cases might be a better word. We don't track our expenses that way, so we just track them in residential, commercial. So I've just simply taken all of the commercial costs and divided them across the program areas.
Sure. Thank you. And so now moving towards the program incentives, can you confirm whether, so the total amount for 2022 was $935,457. Does that number include customer side make ready costs?
Which table are we referring to, Ms. Jones?
Within late file exhibit
Okay, table 2.
126.
So your question again, I'm sorry if you could repeat.
So for the total amount for 2022 for program incentives was $935,457.
Yes.
So can you confirm whether that number includes incentives made for customer side make ready costs?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. And do you know how much of that number consists of customer side make ready costs?
So for 2022, it would be all customer side. As we discussed during the first round of testimony, we didn't really have any utility side make ready costs in 2022.
Okay.
So that number would be consistent of all customer side make ready
Okay,
behind the
thank
meter.
you. And that number does not include incentives made towards EVSEs.
Yes, it's all inclusive. So it would be EVSE, customer side, and any utility side make ready costs.
Okay. So is it possible to provide the number or the amount of incentives provided for EVSEs versus the customer side make ready costs?
Yes, I might have that information with me today.
Mhm.
So I can look. If I don't have it with me today, I might have to ask
Okay.
you to take a supplemental.
Sure. I might ask that for that as a supplement to late file exhibit 126.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you provide customer side make ready incentives to residential customers?
In a way, so the $500 incentive that goes towards the installation of a level 2 charger that the authority has authorized is in a sense customer side make ready.
Okay. And in your own kind of company accounting, when you're tracking those incentives, do you track them as customer side make ready or do you track them as the upfront incentive?
No, we track them as we actually track them as what we call, what's been referred to in REO4 and subsequent orders program review as wiring rebates.
Great. Okay, thank you. So, would you say that the majority of the customer side make-ready incentives are provided to commercial customers?
So yes.
Okay. And do you know which program areas or EVSE types require the most customer side make-ready incentives? In other words, is there one program area that you've seen more of these required?
Yes, so that would be the DC fast charging program area. So the infrastructure required to build out DCFC charging infrastructure is, just in general, due to the larger capacity rating of that equipment, is generally much more expensive than the other level 2 program areas.
Okay. And would you say that the DCFC would require greater kind of infrastructure investments on the customer side? And are
We-
those make-ready incentives provided towards those costs?
Yes, so we anticipate and we have budgeted for utility side make-ready incentives for the DC fast chargers, particularly as more DC fast chargers are built and come online throughout the state. I think that there will be a move towards, and actually, most recently in 220806, the companies introduced a new evaluation criteria for DC fast charging, and in that criteria, we suggested that the projects that get selected for DC fast charging incentives are larger installations, including meaning larger number of plugins at each site, higher capacity rating, so that in a sense that future-proofs and provides faster charging infrastructure. And so those two factors alone will ensure that these will be higher capacity sites. So we would envision that, yes, there will be future utility side make-ready costs paid by customers or applicants or participants of the program.
Right. Okay, thank you. Those are all of my questions. Thank you, panel.
Thank you, Ms. Wiregrass. Ms. Culhane. I believe that completes Authority Cross. Attorney Wright. Thank you, sir. Attorney Marshall. Okay.
Afternoon, Ashley Marshall on behalf of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I just have a couple of clarifying questions. Just now in the exchange with Pura staff, you mentioned that the company uses a cloud platform. I believe that was with respect to the conversation about the technology integration costs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yesterday in cross with the O&M panel, I believe EOE was questioning. The company also testified that they did not have cloud platforms, is what I recall. And I was just wondering if you could explain that discrepancy.
Well, maybe, so I'm not sure, I'm not privy to the line of questioning that occurred yesterday, but so when I refer to cloud, is, sorry? Oh.
Services. So I guess I use it relative to
Sorry, I didn't realize there was someone behind me. So when I refer to it as a cloud platform, I might have misspoken in the context that it was discussed yesterday. So I'm glad someone was here to remind me. So when I refer to it as a cloud platform, I refer to it as a sense that each individual connected device, whether it be a electric vehicle telematics in someone's vehicle or a level 2 charger, smart charger, communicate data to the platform via the internet, and we send signals to control load during demand response events, or in the case of active managed charging in this year, also through the internet.
So to confirm, the company does not use cloud platforms in the traditional
Yes,
layman sense?
that's correct. Yeah, I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Attorney Marshall. Any questions from the bench? I'm all set. Thank you. Do you need a moment to consider redirect? Sure. Well,
Sure, I'm not sure we have anything. I just want to confirm with
Okay.
the panel.
very good. We'll briefly recess.
The company has no redirect.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Then we will take our lunch break. Let's recess until 1:15, at which time we will resume with our final panel. And then a reminder to the attorneys for all parties and interveners to be present at the conclusion of the panel to cover any administrative matters. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me come back. 1:15.
You're no stranger to here.
I guess it's part of the
No, I guess it's food like that. No, we do.
No, stop.
Greg Robinson.
It was more professional than
That's excellent. Last day's the send up. There you go.
Wednesday. We're getting there. Yep.
Like $30 ATM or anything? Sure. No. I gotta work really hard to get it.
You know, it's like. Things are not cheap, you know, it's like, no matter how cheap people advertise, you know, their classes start at, I see all these commercials, I'm like, yeah, this is like, you get in there, it's like, I don't really like to be these cheap friends. How's it going?
It's going. How are you?
Oh.
Are you?
Yeah, well, yeah. And then you want one more tech issues. I gotta worry
I
about
told
that.
you, right?
Scratch resist.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, so progressive.
Only got a little longer.
Dark windows. I don't.
You saw it under the chair, I didn't know whose it was.
I think it was Fitz, because I've seen him.
Who?
James. They put him over the desk.
Yep.
It's funny how like I remember this at the first hearing, so like the whole room was like so full at the first. And now
Filled out a little bit.
Oh, no, that's it. Did you save it on your phone? I think it did. This is your moment. It's all done. This is one moment. We're in here. He's like, here. Hello, Rita.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, Ann, how are you?
How are you?
Thanks, good. It was good to see you. How was your ride? Good. Yeah, I was gonna say.
Beautiful, yeah. Morning ride went down, very nice.
See. Yeah, no one wants to hear this.
Yeah, we just got one financial person.
One person, okay. And the OCC legal holding up their hair there. I guess even EOE has abandoned us. Oh, no, I spoke too soon. She's here. And,
Yeah, the Attorney General.
yeah. Who is that fellow in the back with the computer that you said?
That's Chris Perry.
Okay.
He's on EOE.
Oh, he's the accountant.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember him from the water rate case. I think that's for our purposes, if we want to do. Yeah, Andy's is in. 136 and 137. And 139 and 145.
Okay, any administrative matters before we resume? Okay, very good. Any late filed exhibits from this panel to adopt? Yes, okay, thanks.
Yes, so all of the panel members were previously sworn. And Mr. Donnelly has already adopted his late file exhibit request.
Very good.
Ms. Bulkley and Mr. Ortega, as part of your preparation for this late filed exhibits hearing, did each of you sponsor or co-sponsor responses to late filed exhibit requests issued during the course of evidentiary hearings in this case?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. And do you have any changes or corrections to any of your late filed exhibit responses?
No.
And do you adopt your late file exhibit responses as part of your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. The witnesses are available for cross-examination.
Very good, thank you. We'll begin with authority staff, Ms. Skouras, please.
Good afternoon, panel. Rita Skouras for the authority. Thank you very much. Let me move over closer here. If we would reference your late file 136, and I believe Attorney Riley has brought that up on the screen. Regarding, I have a couple of questions here regarding short-term debt and capital structure. Regarding the company Central Maine Power, which is part of the Avangrid network, could you give us some background as to what the extent the short-term debt for Central Maine Power supports the rate base, number one, and number two, if the company can explain what factor or factors led the Maine Commission to include the short-term debt in the permanent portion of the rate-making capital structure.
Sure, I can start and think the rest of the panel will have some insights as well. And similar, good insight and good question, because I had similar questions when Dak did some research. And I know in this particular question, we were looking at the past decade, and it seems like the Maine Commission, not only for CMP, but also for the other large electric utility in state, Versant, has included short-term debt in that permanent capital structure for quite some time. Can't really tell you exactly why. Doesn't seem to be explicit. It's a state of Maine and commission perspective that they've held for, again, at least the last decade or more for both electric utilities in state. In terms of CMP and how that particular element of the capital structure supports the operation of the company, Mr. Ortega can give us more specifics in a moment on the percentage. It's a small percentage. Overall, just like we've discussed with UI here, there are working capital needs of CMP, and that's what the short-term debt is predominantly used to fund and to support. The capital investment cycle is similar, electric distribution company, and they have a similar capital investment program and size of capital investment. So that's not very different from what we see here at UI. I'm going to pause for Mr. Ortega if you'd like to add anything on the level of short-term debt.
The level of short-term debt for CMP is quite low. I'll get you the percentage in a second. I have to look for it. But like Mr. Donnelly has expressed, is supporting construction and work in progress for the most part, based on the CapEx schedule that those companies have and historically has been used. But in that jurisdiction and in the gas companies, given in Connecticut, given the gas companies and typically the type of investments that the gas companies make are more short term in this case, less than 12 months. That's because the expansion of the gas lines or the existing upgrades, right, don't require as long as in the electric utilities. But I'll give you in a second the CMP number.
Okay, well, while you do that, I do have a question for Ms. Bulkey. You want something to add? Okay,
Yeah,
go
if I
ahead.
could just add to that, you know, across the country, when short-term debt is included in the capital structure, it's often with reference to the amount of short-term debt that would be greater than construction work in progress that is maintained by the companies in their ongoing operations. So typically what's looked at is what is the level of construction work in progress, and the difference between that and the short-term debt balance, that increment, is what might be considered in some of these jurisdictions that I've identified in late file 136.
Okay. If you recall your testimony with Dr. Woolridge, he mentioned that he did look for this company to see how much short-term debt was supporting the rate base. Is this what you're getting at here?
Yes, that's exactly right. So in being able to look at the difference between the amount of short-term debt and construction work in progress, that increment can be sometimes thought of as supporting rate base. It sometimes is also supporting other operations of the company as well. So it's not really a perfect indicator, but it's a way of indicating how much of the short-term debt might be related to funding long-lived assets.
Okay, and just to be clear, for the company Avangrid, I'm sorry, the whole network, the only company that you have experience that has that situation is the Central Maine Power?
And the gas utilities in Connecticut, SCG and CG.
Right, that's correct. But for electric, just
for electric, only that one that is considered, and the percentage that we have right now is less than 2% of the capital structure. So short-term debt will represent just below 2%.
Has the company experienced a rate case with Central Maine Power recently or in the last year?
We filed, you're going to speak, Mr. Donnelly, maybe.
Just let you know, we're in the middle of an ongoing rate case now, as we had filed back in August of 2022, continuing to work through that process. Mm-hmm. Our last rate case prior to that was from 2018.
Okay, so the last rate case, they did include it, subject to check. What is your proposal for this case that's going? Are you including it as a part of the company's proposal, or is it something that the Maine will just potentially impose?
I will confirm that before we conclude here, and just to give you a definitive answer.
All right, maybe that we should do that as a read-in or something.
Okay, I think we're up to read in 9, maybe.
Thanks. All right, we'll move on from that. But I just wanted to be clear, for Ms. Bulkey, you identified some other states here regarding the short-term debt being used in the authorized capital structure, and you identified gas or electric. Do you know of these states, which are the ones doing the electric offhand?
I need to go back and take a look at that. I think North Dakota and Montana are both electric. Illinois is gas. This is electric.
So just the North Dakota and what did you say, Minnesota?
North Dakota, Montana, and are electric.
Repeat that.
I'm sorry, North Dakota, Montana, and Kansas, I know, are electric.
And is it the case there that it's just a rule of thumb that they do, or is it a case-by-case basis?
It is case by case, and it is looking at like I said, my understanding is it's looking at the actual short-term debt over and above construction work in progress.
Okay, so that would be similar to the analysis that Dr. Woolridge described to us, where he was clarifying how he determines if the rate base is being supported by short-term debt.
I believe that's correct, yes.
Have you testified in any of these electric states that are incorporating it?
I have testified in North Dakota, Montana, and Kansas. North Dakota, I have testified for a gas company. I'm trying to think through whether it was a gas or electric. I believe in Montana, I have testified for an electric company.
Okay, and in that case, they incorporated it?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
That's correct.
And I'm assuming it's going to be a small amount? Or?
It is very small, yes. My recollection is that it would be on the order of 1%, somewhere in that range, very small amounts.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Whole process. Because it's just going to keep going. Thank you. Oh, okay. Sure. Thanks. Maybe we'll move the chair out. Move closer. Thanks. Okay.
Ms. Garth, I do have read-in 9.
Oh, great.
This is a good time frame.
Sure.
In our proposal, we did include a hypothetical capital structure consisting of 50% equity, 48.87% long-term debt. There's a little bit of preferred equity, that's 0.02%, and 1.11% short-term debt, just consistent with past precedent decisions and actions taken by the commission.
Would you mind giving me the preferred amount, preferred stock?
Sure, 0.02%.
Oh, wow, that is tiny. Okay. Thank you. So, all right, if we move now to reference late file 139, and there will be also a cross-referencing to 145. Late file 145, we'll begin with late file 145, which is an issue I want to explore related to gross regulated electric revenue to total revenues versus the approach the company calculated its threshold of percentage regulated electric operating income to total revenues. Okay, I'll let you get there.
Yes, I'm there.
Okay, subject to check when the percent of electric revenue to total revenue is defined as gross revenues and not the percent regulated electric operating income as suggested by the company to the total revenue. This late file shows us that the following companies would potentially pass or come very close to passing. For example, staff has brought up the exhibit for you and I've highlighted them in yellow. I'll read it in the record. CMA Energy at 67.59, Consolidated Ed at 69.93, Dominion 81.97, First Energy at 100%, Hawaiian Electric 88.5, Pinnacle West 100, PPL 93.78, and Southern at 72.95. That's from your response. Would the company concur that the refinement it makes to define that selection factor of the percent of revenue to total revenue, of electric revenue to total revenue, to make it percentage regulated electric operating income and not the gross electric revenue makes a significant difference as to what companies are passing a 70% threshold for peer group selection.
Well, some of these companies that you identified wouldn't pass the 70% threshold.
They would come
Applied-
close, right?
applied
60.
Strictly.
I mean,
Right.
what's the difference between 70 and 69.93? If you round it up, it's 70.
Right, that's correct, but the CMS energy would be 67.59, and so I.
But
I
it's
think
still
that's
pretty
s-
close. I
well,
don't,
the cutoff that we've used has been 70%, and it's been a hard 70. But
okay.
I would say that, as I discussed in my testimony, operating income versus revenue is a better representation of what the contribution of the regulated entities are to earnings, and earnings are the driver of value. And so that to me is a more representative screen.
Okay, but
Um,
your screen is actually cutting out some big electric companies, for example, Con Ed and Dominion.
Companies that own generation and the revenues associated with those companies would be related to generating electricity that is a pass-through of cost, right? So that's not an earnings determinant. So what we're looking at when we use operating income is we're trying to identify the companies that actually have contributions to earnings from regulated operations. So similar to gas companies that have a tremendous amount of revenue associated with gas costs, those costs are a pass-through and they don't actually affect earnings. And so that's the same concept when we're using revenue for the electric utilities. You're capturing in some of these companies, particularly the companies that you identified, First Energy, Dominion, are significant examples of companies, Pinnacle West, where their revenues are largely related to a large portion of their revenues are related to generation, which is a pass-through cost similar to the gas cost. Some of these other companies, as we talked about when I was here last, have been excluded based on other screens and other risk factors. And so while they wouldn't necessarily make my operating income screen, and they might have passed this screen, there would be other screens that these companies wouldn't pass. For example, Pinnacle West, we talked about to a great extent when I was here a few weeks ago, and the risks associated with bad regulatory outcomes in that particular jurisdiction and how it affected their stock price and it affected the risk associated with those companies. And I think at that time we spoke a little bit about how the market perceives that risk. And I think you would ask me at that time, do equity analysts actually factor in those risks, and are they actually paying attention to rate cases? And we spoke about that. I think you spoke about that with Dr. Woolridge as well. So in the case of Pinnacle West, I testified at that time that that was very much the case, that the equity analysts had paid attention. Since that time, we've seen a similar circumstance with the Aquarian order here in Connecticut, and the equity analysts that have commented on the decision that was released last week in Connecticut. And there have been several equity analysts who have demonstrated concerns, significant concerns about that decision and how that affects the company. And so those factors are all very important when you're thinking about the screening criteria, and making sure that you have companies that are actually of comparable risk, beyond just the electric revenue to total revenue.
Okay, but that is your approach, correct? We also have an alternative approach based upon the OCC's methodology. Is that correct?
Well, I think I think Dr. Woolridge did testify to that. There are many approaches to screening a proxy group. What we're looking for is trying to come up with risk that's generally speaking comparable. I think, one of the things that we talked about a lot was, making sure that the risk profile of the company was generally speaking, that proxy companies were similar to the subject company. And we talked about the risk profile of each of those companies and their recovery mechanisms. So a lot of those factors are important to establishing comparability.
Okay. Does the company believe in the statistical axiom of the law of large numbers? That is, when you're doing statistical analysis, more observations are better than fewer observations?
I think you have to be careful how you use that. More, it's the quality of the observations. So assuming all observations are of equal quality, more would be better. But I think we have to start with what's the quality of the observation. So I could make a proxy group of companies that have nothing at all to do with the subject company and have lots of observations. But if they're not comparable, it's irrelevant.
Okay, so that was actually going to be my next question. I was going to say, assuming all else equal in terms of the proxy group risk profile, would the company concur that a proxy group consisting of more companies is better than a proxy group of fewer companies, assuming relatively equal risk, company risk profile?
Well, what I've attempted to do is balance that actually in developing my proxy group. And so not
But
only
you would agree to that, though? That
Well, I would
if you have a bunch of companies and they all have about the same risk profile, it's better to have more than fewer.
if they are of similar risk, yes. But I do think that you cannot define that by one variable, such as the total electric revenue to total revenue. There are many more factors, which I think I identified and provided in the late file. I referenced it, we sent it to you in RRU 80. Attachment 1 was the full list of screening criteria that I relied on. And then I think I spoke to you, or at least read into the record, some of the additional factors that were considered with respect to Hawaiian and Pinnacle West being the differences in the risk profiles of those companies.
Okay, thank you. In past testimony, you've presented before me in the past, and you have testified to the best of my recollection that generally in your analysis you look for at least 12 to 13 companies. Is that correct when you do the cost of capital?
We're looking for as broad a group as we can get that is comparable. Over time, different companies come in and out, and you may have a smaller group or a larger group, sort of depending on what's happening in the marketplace. So if companies are in the middle of a merger, they might come out. That might be the only reason that they come out. If they're in a transformative transaction, they come back into the proxy group when those transactions are complete. So I'm not really looking for a specific number. I'm looking for the most comparable group that I can get.
Well, with regards, for example, the water industry, which Value Line follows about 6 or 7, to the best of my knowledge, you do recommend that we open that type of proxy group up to non-water companies like the LDC gas. Is that correct?
Yes, I have done that. And it's largely because even though the water group is 6 or 7 companies, when you apply the various screening criteria, you can often find yourself in a situation where there might be 3 or 4. Many of the water companies do not have growth rates that have been followed by Value Line or some of the other equity analysts. And so the data is very limited and they screen out because there's no information to use to actually perform the cost of equity models.
Okay. Subject to check, would you accept that the Value Line book, that produces the statements, follows 35 electric companies in total, and I'll break it out for you. Central electric companies would be 13, East companies are 11, and West has 11. So these are the sectors.
That's about right.
Okay.
While they follow them, though, I think it's important to note, I think we spoke about MGE when I was here a few weeks ago. They actually produce a report for MGE, but they do not produce growth rates for MGE. So that is probably a reasonable representation of the overall universe of companies that they track. It may not produce data that's available to run the cost of equity models.
Okay.
For all of them.
Sure. Thank you. Regarding your last presentation here for UI was in the 2016 rate case. Do you have an idea of how many companies have left the Value Line pool since 2016? Have any dropped off?
They have merged. There have been some transformative transactions since 2016. One that I can think of off the top of my head would be Westar and, oh, it's terrible that I can't think of the other company,
WEC?
KCP&L forms Evergy. So there are, combinations like that that have reduced the number of companies over time. At one time, there were 90 plus companies covered by Value Line.
You concur then the primary reason for such decline in the pool of companies being followed in the value line is primarily the merger, or as what you call the transformative transaction?
That would be one of the factors, yes.
Okay. Based on your refinement of that threshold that's looking at percentage of revenues from the electric services of going to the 70% regulated electric operating income to total revenues, as opposed to another methodology where you'd be using just gross electric revenues to total. Your process eliminates 18 companies out of the 35, or approximately 50% of the electric value line pool in total that's out there in total from consideration in the cost of equity analysis. Do you accept that subject to check?
Just a moment. What did you say? I'm sorry?
I said 18 are eliminated. So I'm sorry, 17 are eliminated, leaving 18 companies. So about 50%.
That may be true. So
subject to check.
Yes, but as I said, it wouldn't be necessarily based only on that screen. So certain companies, for example, CenterPoint had a dividend cut. So we wouldn't typically include a company that has had a cut in their dividends. That's an indication of difference in risk. And certainly when you're assuming that the DCF model requires constant growth, a company that has cut its dividend fails that test. Same thing would be the case for Dominion and DTE. Some of the companies were involved in transformative transactions. That would be CenterPoint. So even though CenterPoint they would have been out on multiple screens. Exelon as well. First Energy was involved in a transformative transaction, a merger or a divestiture of assets. OG&E the same.
Okay.
P&M, right? So there are some companies that would come out regardless of the screen.
Based on your approach, though.
Well,
regardless,
those
based
are all
on your
transformative transactions that most analysts exclude on the basis of some kind of merger.
I do have questions on that, so let's not linger here. Regarding Dr. Woolridge's rule that he uses, which is the 50% of gross electric revenues to total company revenue, his approach approximately eliminated 11 companies, subject to check. I don't know if you had a chance to look at his recommended proxy group, but it's somewhat higher than yours in terms of the companies included.
Yes. Well, I did not look at that in terms of any of these late files that we're talking about, but I believe that was addressed. The differences in proxy group were addressed in my rebuttal testimony.
Right.
I think I identified several of the companies and why we wouldn't include them. Two I can think of we've just spoken about would be Hawaiian and Pinnacle West, again, focusing on the risk associated with those companies.
Okay, well, given there's this difference in approach as to the screening threshold, and given that you've testified here that you agree that the pool of companies followed by Value Line has been shrinking over time due to consolidation of the industry, why do you continue to use that 70% regulated electric operating income to total? And second, would it be more reasonable to lower the 70% threshold to some other number, like 60 or 65% to let more companies in the proxy group under the presumption that more companies to analyze is better than fewer?
I think that that screen is actually the driver of this concern. If I were to look at RRU 80 attachment 1 that I provided you, which indicates why each of the companies was excluded from the proxy group, 26 of the companies met that screen. So there were 10 companies that were eliminated because they did not meet that screen. Other screens were relied on in order to establish a proxy group that was comparable. And I was describing some of those screens and how other companies came out. So I think.
Well, the question is, given the situation where we have is a shrinking value line pool, why are we sticking with the 70% threshold rather than a smaller one, given the pool of companies is smaller now to analyze?
Well, again, I think it's the quality of the data, not the quantity of the data. And we spoke of that earlier. So we're establishing the cost of equity and a return on equity in this case for a company that's actually 100% electric operations, distribution electric operations. So if you continue to lower the screen such that the screen bears no resemblance to the companies that we're actually establishing a return for, I think we've violated the comparability standard. So I've maintained that screen because we're looking at a company that is 100% electric.
Do you
So
use
we've already lowered it some.
Well, I mean, you're not going to find many other 100% electric companies in the value line, are you?
Right, that's correct. But we're looking for, as I said, it's a balancing act in terms of developing the proxy group and looking for the most comparable companies. And I don't think that lowering the percent contribution of operating income from electric operations would make those companies more comparable, the companies that you've brought in.
Now, do you use that 70% regulated electric operating income threshold in all your cost of capital testimony nationwide for electric companies? If not, why not?
I believe we stay pretty close to that. Certainly, there are circumstances where there might be other screens that we've applied in order to address different risk factor that makes it.
Revenue screens, or
no, I've never used a revenue screen.
Well, I think I would describe this as a revenues, like revenues to total.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't hear your question correctly.
Okay,
Would you mind repeating for me?
When you do other analysis nationwide, do you use that 70% regulated electric operating income to total revenues threshold in all your cost of equity analysis, or do you have like case by case percentage that you look at?
No, so it's operating income to total operating income, not to total revenue.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're correct. Sorry, I was using term.
And I do use operating income. I do not use revenue across the country.
Okay. So, and it's always 70%?
For the electric companies, I believe that's true. I would have to go back and look. There are circumstances where other screens, as I was saying, are stronger indicators of the risk profile associated with those companies. For example, companies that have a tremendous amount of coal-fired generation and maybe are facing the risk factors associated with transition from a coal-fired fleet to a renewable fleet. That would probably have a greater weight. And so we would be looking to try to establish a proxy group that had those same risk factors in order to establish a group that was reasonably comparable. It's possible that we may have lowered that to 65 in order to be able to accomplish that group, but it's in order to sort of match the risks of the company that I am conducting my study for with the risk of the group.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is you adjust these as needed, basically.
Well, we do assign screening criteria to establish a group that's comparable. Yes.
Okay.
So to the extent that there's a screen, particularly the companies that are vertically integrated have just different risks that require different screens.
Okay, you have testified previous in Connecticut with regards to electric. Subject to check, you would agree that your screening approach here on the revenue side is much higher bar than what the authority uses. We have, subject to check, used 70% of electric revenues to total. So very similar to Dr. Woolridge, just a higher percentage that we first, instead of 50% that he used, we use 70% in past testimony.
That may be the case. You're asking me if I know that you use 70.
If you
is that the
recall
question?
that from the 2016 rate case where it'd be described.
I don't recall that specifically, but that may be the case.
Okay. Let's move on now to late file 139, and I have some questions here on your dividend screen, primarily related to Dominion and PPL Corp. Subject to check, the company indicated that those were screened out. Those two companies, Dominion and PPL Corp, were screened out because they cut their dividends. Do you recall that? I think you even talked about it earlier
Yes.
today.
Yep.
Dominion cut it in 2021 and PPL in 2022, according to your narrative. Regarding the cut in 2021, why is that sufficiently current that Dominion be excluded from the proxy group at this point?
And we typically rely on 3 years because that's the base that Value Line starts from in calculating their projected growth rates. So they start with a base of a 3-year average. And so to the extent that there was something within that 3-year period that caused the company to cut its dividend, we would not want to rely on the data from Value Line for that 3-year period.
Same answer then for the PPL?
Yes, if it's
Okay,
within
so-
a 3-year period, we won't include it because the growth rates that are being calculated by Value Line start with an average of 3 years and then a projection of 3 years, and the growth rate that they report is the growth over that time period with a 3-year average base compared to a 3-year projected.
Now, regarding Dominion and probably PPL, both of those companies did not suspend their dividend. They just reduced it but continued to pay. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the issue here with the 3-year increasing dividend, where is that coming from? Is that coming from your discussion here about Value Line and how they use 3 years for projection purposes?
The increase is because we're using a constant growth DCF, which requires the assumption under the constant growth DCF is increasing dividends every year. So if the company hasn't displayed that is actually increasing, but rather has cut its dividend, then it actually violates that assumption. And if it has done so in the last 3 years, that's where the Value Line base comes into play, is that, the growth rates for Value Line are based on those 3-year averages.
Okay, the constant growth DCF you indicated requires increasing dividends, but
Yes, we make
what
the-
you're overlaying to it is the 3-year function that you say is related to Value Line. Is that correct?
Yes, I've held companies out for dividends that have been cut over 3 years, over a 3-year historical period.
Okay.
And that is related to the data that we use from Value Line,
Okay.
because that base would be affected by that cut.
Right. Again, you've been testifying here for some time, and with regards to the last UI rate case, there was the authority's approach here on this dividend is a little bit not as strict. We typically are looking at 8 quarters or essentially 2 years of dividends. Subject to check, if I incorporate my methodology for whatever reason, that would change the analysis here on what companies can be excluded for dividend reduction or cutback, as you described. 3 versus 2 years.
It would, but it would also render the use of DPS growth rates from value line unusable.
Well,
because your dividend growth rate so your base for the 3-year base that value line is using would have a dividend cut in it. So your growth rate would be skewed based on the cut in the dividends. So you would not be able to use a dividend per share growth rate. That would not make sense.
Okay,
If there had
but
been a
what
cut
about
over that 3-year period.
okay,
dividend
dividends
growth
per
rates wouldn't
share,
work.
but what about the earnings per share? That's what you're using anyways.
Yes, I am using earnings,
So
but
the answer you just gave doesn't even apply to your methodology of only relying on earnings per share.
well, you asked about your approach.
Oh, okay.
So I was responding to your approach with respect to dividends.
That would
per
only be
share.
one factor, one growth factor among many growth factors that the authority might look at.
So the dividend cuts dividends are a function of management discretion, of course, but there's typically a rationale for why a dividend has been cut that may be earnings oriented. So you'd have to look at that in each of the cases.
Is there any requirement in the original Gordon DCF model that different dividends be increasing indefinitely for and rely on that 3-year base that you talked about?
I think the constant growth DCF does require constant growth in dividends. Right?
Okay,
I
but
think
doesn't
that's
require that they be 3 years going back too, right?
No, I don't believe there's any specification in the financial model about the cuts, just that there be constant growth.
Okay. Now, again, with late file 139, transformative event screen and from talking to you today, I believe what you're talking or trying to describe as transformative event is basically mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs. Is that correct?
No, as we spoke before, I have also included things that affect the stock price significantly. For example, the Pinnacle West case that we spoke about last time I was here, that actually had a pretty significant effect on the price of the stock as well as the growth rate for that stock. The price of the stock as a result of that rate case determination that we spoke about dropped 24%, and its growth prospects went from 3% to 0.1%. So a very significant effect from a rate case determination. And so for that reason, I excluded Pinnacle West because the market data there was not appropriate to be using in this model in perpetuity.
Okay, just to follow up there, this matter that you use about things that are impacting the stock price is that a issue that is specific to your approach, or is it defined as a transformative event? Because it's very unclear in the analysis here what you exactly meant with a transformative event. I took it to mean, mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, which is what the authority has deemed to be valued for exclusion from a proxy group. But this concept that of bad news, I don't know how that can be clear, clearly defined as a transformative event. Companies get bad news all the time, or good news.
Well, what we're doing here is trying to estimate the investor required cost of equity. And so those risk factors are significant in terms of what investors think the cost of equity would be for a company. So Pinnacle West was a great example. We've had an example that, was part of late file 133 with the Aquarian decision, where, we filed the Bank of America report, and equity analysts have tremendous concerns associated with that particular decision, and it's the effect of that decision on Aquarian as well as other companies here in Connecticut. There have been, since that report came out, there have been 3 other reports that focus on that particular regulatory decision: a Moody's report, a Guggenheim report, and S&P's RRA, all of which have viewed that particular regulatory decision as very negative. And specifically, the Bank of America report indicated that their conversations with equity analysts were very negative about that decision. And so these things are very important to be considering when you're trying to establish a proxy group of comparable companies, because the investor required return for those companies, the willingness to invest in these companies, first of all, changes based on these regulatory outcomes, and the ability to accurately capture the investor required return in the models changes significantly when a company is in a situation where a regulatory decision has put them at risk.
Okay, going back here, again, with the bad news that you indicates flag Pinnacle West for exclusion, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, if I recall, many years ago, we had a situation with UI with a bad rate case. There was like a day or two of bad news with the stock price, but then the company's stock price came back. Do you remember that? It might have been an issue with the last 2016 rate case.
Yeah, I don't think that was a day or two of bad news. I think the stock price plummeted for an extended period of time, much like Pinnacle West. And much like, the circumstances in this late file that we've just provided, that these decisions make a difference. The late file exhibit that we provided, attachment 1 to late file 133, that indicates that equity analysts expect there to be a negative EPS exposure for Eversource as a result of that case, as well as other Connecticut companies, including Avangrid. So they extrapolate beyond the case that's determined. So those decisions are not just bad news. They actually affect the regulatory jurisdiction. They affect the ability of the companies in that regulatory jurisdiction to they affect investor confidence in those companies and the ability of those companies to access capital. It's not just a day of bad news, Ms. Kerr. It makes a big difference in the ability to attract capital for these companies. The RRA report that I referenced earlier with respect to Aquarian, based on that one regulatory decision, RRA reduced the regulatory ranking for the state of Connecticut 2 notches based on that one decision. As I indicated in the Bank of America report, the expectation is a 3% earnings hit for Eversource as an overall company, as well as the potential for other Connecticut companies. So these are very significant events.
I have a couple of questions here about some other companies that you may have answered. In terms of Dominion, Exelon, PPL, the reason for exclusion is primarily that the dividend suspension, or I'm sorry, not suspension, but reduction, or in this case, transformative event where within your 3-year time frame. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we covered that. Those are the dividend cuts are based on a 3-year screening, 3-year time period, consistent with the value line growth.
Is that 3-year term also applied to the transformative events such as the spin-off that you cite here for the pipeline to Dominion and
No,
Exelon?
the transformative events would only be for as long as they are in the stock price data.
And how long is that?
I rely on 180 days. So I do a 30, 90, and 180 days of stock prices. So if those transactions have not closed within that time period, they would be excluded if the transaction was still ongoing during that time period.
So maybe you could just give us the dates these closed then, because your time period goes back, I believe, based on your filing, would go back almost to 2021.
I'm sorry, you're looking for the time period.
The Dominion, Exelon, First Energy, PPL closed their transactions. For example, the Dominion, you say happened in 2021, and we're out here 2023, but that's relevant to be excluded.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that was the
again,
date of the announcement, so I'd have to see when they actually closed the transaction.
so the so we don't know when they closed the transactions.
I would have to get back to you. I don't have that right here. Actually, let me just see if I do.
Dominion. Pipestar, it was acquired as of December 31st, 2021, according to your thing. So 2021 goes a little back. It's like 2 years now.
Right. Well, my proxy group data would have started when this case started. Just see what we used as the screening criteria. Obviously, the screens would have been based on when we filed the direct evidence in this case. That would have been using data from July 2022. It may have been screened the month before, so it would have been just about that time period.
So if he had done it like a month or later, Dominion would have made the
Well, it would have not passed, it would have passed the merger screen, but it still would have had a dividend cut. So it would have not passed the other screens.
Okay.
So Dominion was actually held based on, Dominion didn't meet the dividend screen or the merger screen. That's correct.
Same thing with Exelon. I guess the transaction happened with Constellation. You indicate here 2022 February. So that's about a year now.
2022 in February, as I
That's right.
indicated, the screen was, we did the direct testimony using data as of July 31st, 2022.
So that's the 180 days.
It would have been well within that, actually, 180 trading days, yes.
Okay.
And again, Exelon had a dividend cut.
Okay. Is this 180-day specific to you in terms of going back and seeing what companies are having some kind of dividend, merger?
No, I believe that the FERC relies on it as well.
The 180 days from the date of filing?
Well, the FERC uses 6 months of prices, and so any transactions that would have occurred over the time period of the FERC case would have been excluded on that basis.
Do they go, these cases in FERC take a long time. Do they go from the time of the filing, or, they have 2 years where they could adjudicate something? They don't update to add them back in if the
They do have rebuttal testimony, intervener testimony, so the company would file, and by the time staff files, it's entirely possible that things may have changed.
Okay. So they do update it. They don't rely on the date of filing and then say, okay, from 1/1/2020, I'm going to go back the 180 days and that's it, even though the case could take 2 years to.
Oh, they don't continue updating. No,
No.
I wouldn't say that. So the FERC data, by the time there's actually a decision at FERC, the data is based on, a round of testimony. So the applicant files and then the interveners file, and is usually a rebuttal round of testimony, and then there's no more updating, and it
Right.
could take
I'm
the
sorry to
first 2
clarify,
years to make a decision from that point, but it would be based on that record.
from the rebuttal point.
Right,
Okay.
that's correct.
Now, can we take a look at companies provided in late file 145?
Sure.
This is more of a supplement to the 145. I should have asked at the hearing, but subject to check, these companies are not part of your proxy group, but part of Dr. Woolridge's recommendation that we utilize his Woolridge proxy group. Is that right?
I'm not certain of that, actually. This is the list that you provided me. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if this includes the Rothschild
No.
secondary proxy group or not.
Does not.
Okay.
Yeah, subject to check. It does not. It's just the incremental Woolridge companies. And my question here is, since you are the one who provides capital structures in your record with operating company capital structure, is that correct? When you were doing your capital structure analysis for the recommended,
Yes,
while the other parties are using holding company, is that correct?
that's correct.
Okay. Thus, I don't have in the record these companies' operating company capital structures to evaluate. Would it be possible to supplement 145 to have the capital structures of these companies in a similar presentation to what you did in pre-filed testimony, the UIAEB 13, where you're showing the operating companies? And just so you know, if it involves reinventing the wheel, if it's not something that you have, then I guess we'll have to work with what we have.
No, I can develop it. I have a model that includes most of the companies, so I should be able to develop that. I don't have it completed at the
Right.
moment, but I should be able to develop that for you.
So you just make it comparable to your UI AEB 13
Sure.
and add
Yep.
these
Yep,
as a.
I can do that.
Okay. And I think if that would be a supplement to the late file 145, if the chair would indulge that.
Mhm.
And I think the rest of my cross was for Dr. Woolridge, and unfortunately he's ill. So I think I'm completed with my cross-examination of this panel.
All right, thank you, Ms. Garris. Does the Attorney General have cross for this panel?
We have no questions.
All right, thank you. I believe we're down to questions from the bench. Commissioner Karen.
No questions, thank you. No question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I just have a question or two here. So, Ms. Bulkley, a couple of minutes ago, you alluded to just generally equity analysts' reactions to decisions, and I don't mean it specifically, just in generalities, when equity analysts react to rate case decisions, is there any distinction in their reaction to whether the company is at fault? So, for example, a company has not met its burden, or are they reacting to just the bottom line of the decision and the ROEs or capital structure or what have you authorized therein?
I think that's a fair question. The supplement that I provided, that we provided in attachment 1 to late file 133 discusses the case in total. I think it provides a fairly reasonable summary of the case. It does have tremendous concerns about the long-term earnings risk resulting from the case. So I think, so equity analysts are paying attention to these proceedings. I know we talked about this the last time I was here, and there was a question about whether or not these proceedings actually get any attention from equity analysts. I think it's clear that they are actually paying attention and they are following these types of proceedings online. And so I think they have a general sense of what the proceeding is about. I do think that the financial implications for the companies are of obviously significant importance in terms of whether or not investors are willing to invest in these companies going forward and the risks that are related to the outcomes of these cases. So I do think the outcomes are a very significant concern to the equity analysts.
Okay, so said another way, I mean, just my question generally though is the equity analysts, in your experience, are making no distinction between, whether, the company deserved the outcome that they got versus the outcome itself. And then I think we can have a philosophical debate over whether, in turn, equity analysts are then leaving regulators with no ability to hold a company accountable if they're going to make findings based on just an outcome, even if that outcome was well reasoned and deserved.
Yeah, I think that I understand your question. I do think that the equity analysts are, when they're following, I think they too are trying to understand where they think the outcomes will be throughout a case, right? So I do think that they are following along and trying to get their arms around what the ultimate outcomes will be. And so they're trying to follow regulation when they think about these cases. And I think to the extent that the decisions come back within a range of what they had as an expectation as the outcome from regulation, they are, you don't necessarily see a lot of activity. When there's deviation though from what the expectations were, I think that's where you see the outcomes and the response from the equity analysts be very quick, and you see the market respond very quickly as well. So I think that market, generally speaking, does follow these cases and has a good sense of where they think things should be. And it's the deviation from those expectations that I think creates a lot of risk in the outcomes. You might have more.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to investors on daily basis, almost, and to analysts, right? So they look very closely, in our case, right, what is happening in Connecticut. I mean, they look at expectations. So if they're expecting that the company, is going to have recovery of all the investments that the company is making at, a request that is reasonable. And if that is not met, like Bank of America mentions the 3% decrease in this case, or impact on Eversource, right? They are going to have that they're not going to meet their earning per share that it was mentioned before, and therefore they're going to have less willingness to recommend the stock to the investors. And when we're talking to investors here, we're not talking to just minority investors that is someone buying a share. I mean, here we're having pension funds investing in equity stocks and stocks, in this case for power companies or for energy companies, because it's considered a type of investment that is safer traditionally than other investments. So there is a lot of pension funds or insurance companies that invest, for instance, in energy companies. And I also want to point out not only at what the equity analysts are talking about, our rate case or other rate cases, right? But another report that we recently received, that it was after our ability to file last week, right? It was the Moody's report. And if I can quote real quick what Moody's has said.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I can allow you to quote from it.
Okay.
I mean, the report is not in the record.
It's not in the record, yeah.
I mean, Attorney Venora, without the benefit of seeing that report in full, I'm going to struggle with having that read into the report.
That's fine.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that response, Mr. Ortega. I guess just to circle back a second, if I understood the testimony correctly, the report that was filed in the record suggests that the earnings per share for UI, that there have been ramifications already. So if I could summarize your last response, if the most important thing that the investors are looking at is consistency, and they have already taken into account the application of the standard from the Aquarian decision, then the most important thing to the investors through this case would be to maintain that consistency and see no impact on that earnings per share that you say has already been factored in.
In the case of Eversource.
Was it not your testimony that they have already assessed a earnings per share hit to other Connecticut utilities?
Well, I think they have concerns about that. That's true. So, but I think, I think there will be significant risk to the Connecticut companies if the view is that, well, it's already baked in, so we're just going to we're going to meet that expectation. Versus, there's a lot of investment happening for these companies, and they need to have access to capital. And if the equity investors, they have a choice of where they put their money, right? And so they have a choice of whether to invest in Connecticut companies or to invest in other companies that are all seeking capital for this transformation of the energy industry. And the ramifications, I think, of Connecticut companies being put in a position of very low ROEs relative to the nation is likely to be that investment goes elsewhere. And it's harder for these companies to access capital. And we're in a time right now where there's a lot of volatility in the marketplace, and there's a lot happening in the market. And it looks not maybe as much like 2008, but there's been bank failures. There has been, there's a lot of volatility in the marketplace today. When that happened in 2008, the markets tightened and it was very difficult to access capital. And it would be very unfortunate to put companies in a position where they didn't have the ability to access the capital markets at a time when they really need it.
Okay. I mean, I think we're okay. Is consistency the most important factor? Yes or no?
I don't think it's the most important factor. No, I think being able to maintain their financial stability is actually the factor. That's the driver for these companies. It's being, able to meet their, from a debt perspective, it's being able to meet your coverage ratios, and from an equity, it's being financially stable.
Sure. So through these proceedings, including the one that's been referenced, there's data provided by the company and by other parties and interveners assessing a range of ROEs and capital structures as compared to the published metrics of Moody's, S&P, et cetera. Is that true?
Yes, that's the debt side.
Okay. So move on and ask you a question about Pinnacle. So I think that Pinnacle was relied on by you today and during the evidentiary hearings as an example of something that happened. And I think I heard you cite today to the stock dropping 24%. But what I don't think I heard you distinguish was how much of that percentage drop actually occurred following the downgrade versus before, because I think, subject to check, not that whole 24% occurred after the downgrade.
Oh, no, I don't believe it did. I think it's in my testimony. If you were to actually, so the way that Arizona regulation works is that there's a recommended decision and then there's a final decision. And so I think there's a chart in my testimony that specifically shows the dates, the stock price decline for Pinnacle West, and it has overlaid on that the dates of the recommended decision when that came out and when the final decision came out. And if you were to look at that chart, there was a drop after the first one and a drop after the second one. So the market responded actually prior to any credit rating downgrades. The market response was swift.
Okay, so the actual downgrade occurred. I think I looked at that chart. The actual downgrade occurred mid-October. Only 4% of that drop came in stock price came following the downgrade.
Well, that may be the case. The recommended decision came out prior. So the way that decisions work in, as I said, in Arizona is that there is a recommended decision that comes out first. And so that decision came out and there was an immediate response from equity investors as well as concern raised by Moody's. I don't think the Moody's downgrade occurred until after the final decision, but the credit rating agencies weighed in certainly at the recommended decision at that time.
Okay, and you say it's Pinnacle's stock price being low. Has it rebounded in the years since?
It has come back, but not to the same place that it was prior to the decisions. Its growth rates, however, have not returned. So as I mentioned earlier, their growth rate, their EPS growth rate was about 3%, and it has remained at 0.1 or 0.2%, depending on which source you rely on since that decision.
Okay, and I think your testimony cited a stock price, and there's certainly consistency in the, there's certainly information in the record that suggests a stock price before those decisions in early 2021 in the mid-range of the 80s. And subject to check, I think the range of the Pinnacle stock price has been between $60 and $101 per share in the years since. So I'm wondering if sitting here today, what the stock price of Pinnacle is at this moment.
I don't at this very moment, but we could certainly, do you have it?
Mm-hmm.
So today it's at 76.
Okay, all right. I think those are all my questions. So Attorney Venora, do you need a moment to consider redirect?
Yes, please.
Okay, we will recess briefly.
Okay.
Okay, Attorney Benoit?
Yes, thank you. We just have one question on redirect.
Okay.
Ms. Bulkley, during the last cross-examination, you were referencing, or I think referencing generally a chart that related to the Pinnacle stock price. Is that the chart that it shows as figure 3 on page 56 of your testimony?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, in relation to the timeline there, have there been subsequent events that also affect or reflect the outcome of the regulatory decisions there?
Yes, there are several things to note. And I may have mentioned this in my testimony a week or so ago when we talked about Pinnacle West, but the Pinnacle West annual report after this time period, it would be the 2021 annual report, had a letter to shareholders indicating that they would not issue equity until after they filed another case, so they wouldn't further reduce the equity holders' value in the company at that time. In November of last year, they had a bond offering, and that bond offering was not fully subscribed. So they committed to not issuing further equity. They had a bond offering. They had difficulty actually getting a full subscription on their bonds. Since that time, we just talked about how the price of the Pinnacle West stock has come back some. They did file an appeal with the Supreme Court, and they were successful on certain portions of that appeal. And they have also subsequently filed another rate proceeding. And so those factors are likely to be contributors to the change in price that we've seen since that time.
Okay. Thank you. That's all we have.
All right, thank you. Then with our thanks to the panel, this panel is excused. If I could request attorneys for parties and interveners approach. right, very good, thank you. So in terms of the next steps in this docket, we are scheduled for briefs due on April 20th, followed by reply briefs on May 3rd. The outstanding item I have for consideration is the due date for these supplements. There is not a there's not a mechanism in our case management system for me to upload requests for supplements. So it will just have to be filed as supplements to those late file exhibits in the same way you've previously filed supplements. I am happy to confirm for the record now a full list of supplements that I have a record for.
That would be helpful.
All right, thank you. First, I have a request to refile late file exhibit 52, subject to the corrections from earlier in the proceeding. Then in order, I have a late file exhibit 12 supplement, followed by 2 supplements to late file exhibit 26. A supplement to late file exhibit 45. One supplement to late file exhibit 92. A supplement to late file exhibit 98. A supplement to late file exhibit 106. A supplement to late file exhibit 108. I think there were several requests on that one. A supplemental late file exhibit 126. And finally, a supplemental late file exhibit 145.
Yeah, I have the same list.
Very good. Thank you. If there are no corrections to that, then the remaining matter is the due date for those supplements, recognizing that we have some time before briefs are filed, but I want parties to have the benefit of those supplements. Does the company have a proposal for when you could return those?
1 week. We would say 1 week. If that's
Okay, which puts us at March 29th.
Yeah.
So ask that the company supplement all of the requested late files no later than 4 p.m. on March 29th, which should not disturb our briefing due date of April 20th. Are there outstanding administrative matters that we have not covered? Anything from any parties or interveners? Attorney Wheel.
Thank you. I had one quick question. It pertains to our motion from the other day to adopt our lay files by affidavit. I've gotten an affidavit from our team, from Mr. Schultz and Mr. DeFever. I'm having trouble getting a notarized affidavit for Mr. Woolridge, Dr. Woolridge, because he's still ill. He's not sure when he's going to be able to physically get to a notary. I'm wondering if we can also have until that date, the 29th, to get a notarized affidavit filed?
Yes, allow that. If you can file those affidavits as comments to motion 67, and when all of the affidavits are received, we will issue a motion ruling.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Attorney Venora?
Yeah, Mr. Vaughn just reminded me, so on the current procedural schedule, there's the date for the closing of the evidentiary record as being tomorrow. Then I think that was tied to the final late file hearing date, so I assume that would, or request whether that be extended to the date we file the late filed exhibits.
We'll extend that to March 29th, subject to understanding that the only reason it's being held open at this point is to allow for the supplements. And I do think the company also has, late file exhibit 1, and then there was one other late file exhibit, which was my request during the hearings for an attendance sheet.
Late filed 88. So late filed exhibit 1 has been filed. So
Okay, and there are no further corrections to that.
No, I don't believe there are. And late filed 88 was filed. If the request is to update that, then we did file it, I think as of March 16th.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. I should have been clear. The supplement to 88 through today. So that supplement plus the ones we discussed be filed by 4 p.m. on March 29th, and the record will be held open for the sole purpose of accepting those supplements. Okay, thank you. Anything further? Okay, if not, I thank all parties and interveners on behalf of the authority for your time and attention to this matter. We look forward to reviewing the briefs. So we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, 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 yes.